Claire Dawson, a European-American cabin crew member and an advocate of diversity and inclusion, spoke at her airline seminar about how she embarrassed a senior pilot without knowing, because of his race, and how the incident changed her completely. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, also like the video. Claire Dawson climbed the podium and began her speech. Hello everyone, I am Claire Dawson and I want to appreciate the management of our dear airline to stand here in this diversity and inclusion training seminar to talk to us. I want to tell the story that got me disgusted about racism and made me to start advocating for inclusion of all races. On this particular flight, David Carter settled into the plush first-class seat, savoring a rare moment of luxury. The soft leather cradled his frame, offering a comforting contrast to the rigid cockpit seat he was accustomed to. Dressed casually in a crisp polo shirt and dark jeans, he looked like any other passenger, if not for his practiced demeanor and the subtle air of authority that accompanied him. Today, the veteran airline pilot was not in command. He was simply another traveler on a transcontinental flight from Florida to California, an observer enjoying the perspective from the other side of the cockpit door. As he stored his carry-on overhead, a faint smile played on his lips. First-class travel was an occasional indulgence, one he relished whenever he could. The humid New York summer clung to him, as a light sheen of sweat glistened on his rich, mocha-toned skin. Settling into his seat, David brought out a magazine from his bag and started flipping. Passengers continued filing in, their voices a blend of excitement and impatience. Some glanced his way, curiosity mixed with subtle undertones he recognized all too well. Even in this age, a black man in first class seemed to provoke reactions, ranging from mild surprise to outright skepticism. David focused on his magazine, determined to enjoy the rare downtime. The cabin crew bustled about, preparing for takeoff. Among them was Claire Dawson, a tall, beautiful flight attendant with an expertly practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved through the cabin efficiently, offering pre-flight drinks and adjusting passengers' requests. When she reached David's row, her smile faltered just for a moment. "Good evening, sir," Claire began, her tone polite but clipped. "Could I see your boarding pass, please? I believe there might have been a mistake." David raised an eyebrow, momentarily confused. He slipped the ticket from his pocket and handed it to her without a word. Claire studied it carefully, her brow furrowing as she glanced between the ticket and its holder. "I'm afraid there seems to be an error," she continued, her voice laced with thinly veiled condescension. "This seat is reserved for our premium passengers, and we don't appear to have any more availability here. I'll have to ask you to move to the economy section." David blinked, his calm demeanor masking a rising tide of frustration. He had encountered bias before, but this level of blatant discrimination left him momentarily speechless. After a deep breath, he responded evenly, "My ticket clearly shows this is my assigned seat. Is there an issue with your system?" Claire's smile tightened, a faint nervousness flashing in her eyes. "No issue, sir, but this section is for our premium clientele, and..." She hesitated. "I hope you understand the confusion." The unspoken implication was clear, and David felt the weight of it settle over him. He knew this routine all too well. His qualifications, accomplishments, and experiences meant nothing to those who judged him solely by his appearance. "Perhaps you should check with your supervisor," David suggested, his voice steady but firm. "I am the lead flight attendant," Claire replied, irritation creeping into her tone. "I need you to gather your belongings and move so we can prepare for takeoff." David glanced around the cabin. Some passengers avoided his gaze, pretending not to notice the unfolding scene. Others watched with open curiosity, while a few displayed barely masked disdain. Knowing that escalating the confrontation could sour the flight for everyone, David made a calculated decision. "Very well," he said, standing to retrieve his bag. His voice was measured, though the tightness in his chest betrayed his frustration. "But I'll be speaking with the captain about this before we depart." Claire's relief was palpable as she stepped aside to let him pass. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone perfunctory. I'm sure the captain will address any concerns you have." As David walked to the cramped economy section, his frustration simmered beneath his composed exterior. The stark contrast between the first-class cabin and his new seat underscored the injustice of what had just transpired. Settling in, he let out a slow breath. He had faced worse on his journey to becoming a captain, but the sting of being dismissed so easily cut deep. The economy cabin hummed with activity as passengers jostled to stow their carry-ons and settle into their seats. Captain David Carter observed the scene with practiced ease, his professional instincts noting the crew's efficiency and the varying moods of the passengers. Even from this side of the operation, he couldn't help but assess the flow of the boarding process. As he opened his magazine again, his focus was interrupted by a familiar figure weaving her way down the aisle. Claire Dawson, the first-class flight attendant who had reassigned him, was speaking in low, animated tones with another crew member. Her gestures were hurried, and her eyes occasionally darted toward him. When she finally caught his gaze, her expression shifted. Her eyes widened briefly before she quickly turned away. It was clear she was still discussing the earlier incident. Moments later, Claire approached, her smile professionally fixed but noticeably strained. "Sir," she began, her voice subdued to avoid drawing attention, "I've consulted with my colleague, and it seems there may have been a misunderstanding earlier. Could you please show me your boarding pass again?" David arched an eyebrow, sensing the shift in her demeanor. Without a word, he handed over his ticket. Claire examined it closely, her brow furrowing as she compared the information to him once more. "It does appear," she said slowly, "that you were initially assigned a first-class seat. However, we've encountered an overbooking situation and had to reassign some passengers. I truly apologize for the inconvenience." The explanation fell flat. David had been in the airline industry long enough to recognize a hastily constructed excuse when he heard one. His gaze remained steady as he asked, "And was I the only passenger reassigned due to this supposed overbooking?" Claire's smile faltered briefly. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other passengers' arrangements, sir," she replied, her tone taking on a defensive edge. "I assure you, we're doing our best to accommodate everyone." David leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but resolute. "Miss Dawson, I think we both know this isn't about overbooking. As I mentioned earlier, I'd like to speak with the captain before we depart." Claire's composure cracked. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "the captain is busy with pre-flight preparations to ensure everyone's safety. Perhaps you can address your concerns with customer service once we land in California." David shook his head. "I'm afraid that won't suffice. This is a matter that needs to be addressed now. I have a right to my assigned seat, and I'd like an explanation for why I was moved, especially if I've been singled out." Claire's patience was clearly wearing thin. She straightened, her tone turning cold. "Sir, I've explained the situation. We have policies and procedures in place, and I need you to respect them. Now, please prepare for takeoff like the other passengers." Their conversation had begun drawing attention. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, some pretending to remain engrossed in their devices, while others openly stared. A middle-aged woman across the aisle leaned over, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything all right here?" Before David could respond, Claire interjected quickly. "Everything's fine, ma'am. Just a minor seating issue we're resolving." Her tone left no room for further inquiry, but David seized the moment. "Actually," he said, addressing both the woman and Claire, "I was assigned a first-class seat, but I've been moved without a clear explanation. I'm simply trying to understand why." The woman's eyes widened, her concern deepening as she glanced between David and Claire. Claire's forced smile tightened further. "Sir," she said through gritted teeth, "as I explained, this was a necessary reassignment due to overbooking. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to complete preparations for departure." As Claire turned to leave, David's calm voice cut through the cabin. "I still want to speak to the captain. I'll wait here, but I expect this issue to be resolved before we take off." Claire paused mid-step, her body language betraying her frustration and indecision. After a moment of visible internal debate, she nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do," she said, her tone clipped, before hurrying toward the front of the plane. David settled back into his seat, his composure unwavering. Around him, whispers rippled through the cabin as passengers speculated on what had happened. He paid them no mind. Whatever came next, David was determined to ensure that fairness and accountability prevailed. The low hum of the aircraft engines reverberated through the cabin as the plane prepared for takeoff. David Carter sat stiffly in his cramped economy seat, his thoughts swirling. The tension in the air was palpable, fed by the curious glances, hushed whispers, and unspoken questions of those around him. A young woman a few rows ahead kept turning her head to steal glances at him, her expression a mix of confusion and sympathy. Across the aisle, an older man lowered his newspaper, his sharp eyes studying David with open curiosity. The murmurs from the passengers swelled like a low tide, cresting in waves of speculation. They were trying to piece together what had happened, though no one dared to ask him directly. The flight attendant, Claire Dawson, was nowhere in sight. From his seat, David had noticed her moving between the first-class and economy cabins, her posture tense and her movements hurried. She exchanged furtive words with her colleagues, her eyes darting occasionally in his direction. It was clear she was trying to manage the fallout of what had now become a spectacle. David's jaw tightened as he stared out the small cabin window. His frustration grew with every passing minute. Stripped of his uniform and the authority it symbolized, he was just another passenger, one who had been judged and dismissed based on assumptions. The injustice of the situation burned in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. He wasn't just fighting for himself, this moment was bigger than him. The seatbelt sign ninged on, and a voice over the intercom instructed passengers to prepare for takeoff. David's heart sank slightly. It seemed his request to speak to the captain was being ignored. Just then, a disturbance at the front of the cabin caught his attention. Claire was in an animated conversation with another crew member, a tall, broad-shouldered man who radiated authority. Their voices were low, but their body language spoke volumes. Claire looked flustered, her gestures quick and pleading. The man, on the other hand, remained composed but firm, his demeanor unyielding. David watched as the man's eyes scanned the cabin and landed on him. There was a moment of recognition, followed by a flicker of alarm. Without another word to Claire, the man began making his way down the aisle. The passengers fell into a tense silence, the air heavy with anticipation. When the man reached David's row, he leaned in, his voice low but steady. "Captain Carter," he said, though the formality seemed unnecessary. "I'm First Officer Ethan Myers. There's been a serious misunderstanding. Would you mind coming with me?" A wave of gasps rippled through the cabin. Murmurs erupted as the revelation sank in. Did he say captain? He's a pilot? Oh no. What have they done? David met Ethan's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "I'd be glad to," he said evenly. "I believe there's a matter that needs urgent attention." As David rose, the whispers intensify. His calm demeanor only amplified the sense of gravity in the air. Ethan gestured for him to follow, and together they began walking toward the front of the plane. Passengers craned their necks to watch, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and discomfort. The young woman who had been glancing back at David earlier now looked down at her lap, her cheeks flushed with second-hand shame. The older man across the aisle shook his head, his brows knitted in disapproval, though whether it was for Claire or himself, David couldn't tell. When they reached the galley, Claire stood frozen, her face pale and her lips parted, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Ethan turned to her sharply. "We need to have a discussion in private," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. David crossed his arms and leaned slightly against the bulkhead. "I'd like to understand why I was asked to leave my assigned seat," he said, his voice calm but laced with quiet authority. "And I'd like to know why it took this long to address what's clearly a significant terror." Claire stammered, her confidence shattered. I didn't realize, I wasn't informed." Ethan cut her off. "Captain Carter is one of our most senior pilots. His assignment here today is as a passenger, not as crew. But that doesn't change the respect he's owed. This situation is unacceptable, and we'll be addressing it immediately." David's gaze didn't waver. "Thank you, First Officer Myers, but this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else is ever made to feel the way I was today." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Understood, Captain." Claire swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the two men. I'll make sure the seat is prepared for him immediately." David didn't respond to her directly, but as he followed Ethan back toward first class, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. The passengers, who had overheard snippets of the confrontation, now watched in stunned silence. Ethan Myers, the first officer, led Captain David Carter to the cockpit door, his posture heavy with regret. As they paused outside, Ethan turned, his voice low and sincere. "Captain Carter," he began, "on behalf of the crew, I deeply apologize. This should never have happened." David nodded, accepting the sentiment but withholding forgiveness for now. "Let's ensure it doesn't happen again," he said firmly, his gaze steady. Ethan opened the cockpit door, and David stepped inside. The familiar hum of instruments and the array of controls greeted him like an old friend, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The current captain, a middle-aged man with a commanding presence and streaks of silver in his hair, stood from his chair. His face shifted from confusion to realization as he registered David's face as one of the most senior pilots in their airline. "Captain Carter," the captain said, extending a hand. "I'm Captain Richard Hale. I wasn't expecting this." David shook his hand, his grip firm and professional. "Captain Hale," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, "I was scheduled to be your relief for the next leg of this flight. However, due to a mishandling in the cabin, I was removed from my assigned seat in first class and placed in economy." Captain Hawley's brows furrowed as he glanced at Ethan for confirmation. "Placed in economy," he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Why on earth would that happen? David hesitated for a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "It seems certain assumptions were made, assumptions about whether I belonged in first class, based solely on appearances." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Captain Hawley's face darkened, a mix of embarrassment and anger flashing across his features. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his tone sharp. "I can't apologize enough for this, Captain Carter. I assure you, this behavior does not reflect our values." As if on cue, there was a knock at the cockpit door. Ethan opened it to reveal Claire Dawson, the flight attendant whose actions had ignited this incident. Her confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a pale, nervous expression. "Captains," she began, her voice trembling, I'm here to apologize. I made a terrible mistake and Captain Hale held up a hand, cutting her off. "Miss Dawson, we will discuss this further at a later time. Right now, I need you to inform the passengers of a slight delay. Tell them there's been a crew adjustment, and I'll be addressing them shortly." Claire nodded, her gaze flicking toward David briefly before she retreated down the aisle. Once the door closed, Captain Hale turned back to David. "Captain Carter, I'd like to formally offer you command of this flight as originally planned. I believe it's important for both the crew and the passengers to see you in your rightful place." David considered the offer. A part of him wanted to leave, to walk away from the humiliation and frustration of the day. But another part recognized the significance of this moment, a chance to not only reclaim his dignity, but to turn the experience into a lesson for everyone involved. "I accept," David said after a moment, "but before I take command, I'd like to speak to the passengers." They need to understand what happened and why it matters. Captain Hale nodded, his expression solemn. Of course. Whatever you feel is necessary. A ground crew member soon arrived with David's uniform. As he changed in the cockpit, the muffled sounds of passenger murmurs filtered through the door. News of the delay and crew change had sparked curiosity and speculation. Dressed in his full captain's uniform, David adjusted his tie and straightened his shoulders. He was no longer the passenger relegated to the back of the plane. He was Captain David Carter, a leader, and he was about to remind everyone on board why assumptions and biases had no place in the skies or anywhere else. With one final glance at Captain Hale and Ethan, David opened the cockpit door and stepped into the aisle, ready to address the waiting passengers and turn this flight into an unforgettable lesson in humility, respect, and integrity. Captain Carter took a deep breath and stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin fell into an expectant silence as he walked to the front of the first-class section. Every eye was on him, the weight of curiosity and realization palpable in the air. He could see the faces of passengers, some filled with surprise, others tinged with guilt or embarrassment, those who had witnessed his earlier exchange with Claire. Reaching the front of the cabin, Carter picked up the intercom handset. His voice was calm and steady, carrying the tone of someone used to commanding attention. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Captain David Carter, and I'll be taking command of this flight to California. Before we depart, I feel it's necessary to address something that transpired during the boarding process. He paused, letting his words settle. The cabin was so silent that the faint hum of the aircraft systems felt deafening. Earlier today, I was asked to vacate my seat in first class and move to economy. This decision wasn't due to overbooking, as initially claimed, but rather a misunderstanding rooted in assumptions about me. Assumptions based solely on my appearance, my skin color. A ripple of murmur spread through the passengers, but Carter held his composure. I want to be clear, this kind of prejudice has no place here. It has no place on this plane, in our industry, or in society at large. It is unacceptable. He scanned the cabin, his eyes meeting those of passengers who looked down in shame and others who seemed on the brink of tears. His words were direct, yet his tone carried a quiet dignity. I'm not sharing this to point fingers, but to emphasize something vital. Each of us has a responsibility to look beyond surface-level judgments. We must recognize and respect the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their skin color, gender, or background. We are all human, and dignity is our shared right. Carter paused, giving the passengers a moment to absorb his message. I've chosen to remain your captain today because I believe in facing challenges head-on. I hope this experience serves as a reminder for all of us to reflect on how we treat others and how we can foster understanding and respect in every interaction. A moment of silence followed his words before a single clap broke it, then another, and another. The applause grew, swelling throughout the cabin until it became a standing ovation. Passengers rose from their seats, many with tears in their eyes. The thunderous applause was a testament not just to Carter's words, but to the profound truth they carried. At the back of the first-class cabin, Claire Dawson stood motionless. Her face was a mix of embarrassment and a glimmer of something deeper realization. As the applause subsided, she approached Carter hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain David, she began, her tone filled with emotion, I owe you an apology. I made a terrible mistake, and I don't even know where to start. Carter looked at her, his expression softening. Acknowledging your mistake is a start, Claire. Learning from it is the next step. I hope you'll use this moment to grow. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I will. Carter offered her a brief but encouraging smile before turning back to the cockpit. He felt a renewed sense of purpose as he settled into the captain's seat. Today wasn't just about flying a plane. It was about setting an example, challenging biases, and proving that leadership isn't just about guiding a team or passengers, but also about inspiring change. As Carter prepared for takeoff, the cabin buzzed with conversation. Passengers spoke in hushed but fervent tones, reflecting on the lesson they had all witnessed. Carter knew that the impact of this flight would reach far beyond their destination. The unexpected revelation reverberated throughout the cabin like an unspoken ripple, leaving passengers and crew alike in deep reflection. The silence that followed Captain David Carter's powerful address was gradually replaced by murmurs of admiration, guilt, and self-awareness. A few rows back in economy, where Carter had been relegated earlier, a middle-aged woman with soft eyes wiped away tears as she turned to the next seat neighbor. "To think we had someone so extraordinary sitting right here among us, and we judged him without a second thought. How many others have we misjudged in our lives without realizing it?" "You're right," replied by the old woman sitting beside her. In first class, an elderly gentleman with a neatly trimmed silver beard leaned toward the woman seated beside him. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of his words. "In all my years of flying, I've never seen anything like this. What happened to N is disgraceful, but the way he handled it, that's leadership in its purest form." The woman, a young professional in a sharp navy blue suit, nodded emphatically. "I was right there when it happened. I saw everything. I wanted to speak up, but..." She hesitated, her voice faltering. "I didn't, and now, I feel ashamed. We've got to do better, all of us." At the rear of the plane, a group of college students who had seen the initial altercation were animatedly discussing the event. "Did you see that flight attendant's face when she realized who he was?" one of them said, a mix of incredulity and shame lacing his voice. Another student, more thoughtful, shook his head. "Come on, man. This isn't about rejoicing at or deriving pleasure from the misfortunes of others. It's a wake-up call. Be honest, if you saw a black man in first class, what would your first thought have been?" The question lingered in the air, silencing the group as they grappled with their own biases. Meanwhile, in the galley, Claire Dawson, the flight attendant at the center of the incident, stood with her back to her colleagues, her hands trembling as she tried to gather herself. A fellow crew member approached her cautiously, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Claire, are you okay?" Claire shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. No, I'm not. I've always prided myself on being fair, on treating everyone equally, but today, I failed. I became everything I've always fought against." Her colleague gave her shoulder gentle squeeze. "What matters now is how you move forward. Captain Carter's given us all a chance to reflect. Don't waste it." Unaware of the ripple effects his words had caused, Carter sat in the cockpit, focused on the pre-flight checklist. His movements were deliberate and professional, but First Officer Ethan couldn't help but glance at him with a mixture of admiration and guilt. "Captain Carter," Ethan began hesitantly, his voice unsteady. "I just want to say, the way you handled everything out there, it's inspiring. I'm truly honored to be flying with you today." Carter replied, "Thank you, Ethan, but remember, this isn't about me. It's about all of us learning to see the humanity in one another. If we can take anything from today, let it be that." As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, a sense of quiet determination settled over the aircraft. This wasn't just another flight, it was a journey toward something greater, a shared moment of reckoning and growth. Neither Carter nor anyone else aboard could have predicted it, but the events of this flight would ripple far beyond the confines of the aircraft, touching lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The true impact of this moment was still unfolding. As the aircraft ascended into the endless expanse of the sky, it carried more than passengers and luggage. It carried the weight of a collective reckoning and the promise of change. Beneath the clear, blue horizon lay an uncertain path. True equality and respect, like any journey, would encounter its share of turbulence. At 35,000 feet, the initial shock of the pre-flight events had given way to a contemplative atmosphere. The cabin was unusually quiet, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to the introspective mood. Passengers sat absorbed in thought, some lost in the weight of what they had witnessed, while others engaged in hushed but intense conversations. In the cockpit, Captain David Carter guided the aircraft with practiced precision, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions within. His thoughts drifted to his early days in aviation, the hurdles he'd overcome, the dismissive looks, the coded language of prejudice he'd learned to navigate. Today's events had been a painful reminder of those experiences, a stark reminder of how far society still had to go. First Officer Ethan Myers, sensing the gravity of the moment, finally broke the silence. "Captain Carter," he said hesitantly, "if you don't mind me asking, how do you do it? How do you face this kind of prejudice and still remain so composed?" Carter turned slightly, his gaze steady but reflective. "It's not easy, Ethan," he admitted after a pause. "There are days when it feels like carrying the weight of the world, but I remind myself why I'm here. Every time I put on this uniform and step into this cockpit, I'm not just flying a plane. I'm breaking barriers, challenging stereotypes, and paving the way for others who will come after me." He looked out at the vast horizon, his voice resolute. "It's about turning pain into purpose. Each moment of discrimination I face is an opportunity. Not just to rise above it, but to educate, to shift perspectives, and to push the needle forward, even if only by an inch." The group of college students who had witnessed the incident earlier or locked in a fervent discussion. "I always thought I was pretty aware of these things," one admitted, his voice tinged with guilt. "But today made me realize how many biases I still carry without even knowing it." His friend nodded, a serious expression on her face. "It's not enough to just not be racist. We need to be actively anti-racist. Call it out when we see it, even if it's uncomfortable." As the plane began its descent into California, the atmosphere on board had shifted profoundly. Passengers who had boarded with preconceived notions were now disembarking with a renewed sense of accountability. They had shared more than just a flight, they had shared an awakening. Captain David Carter, as he prepared for the landing, felt the quiet resolve settle within him. Today had been painful, but it was also a step forward. A reminder that changes, though slow and often grueling, was always worth the effort. As strangers who had once shared little more than a flight, the passengers now felt connected by a shared experience and a collective commitment to change. Among them, Claire Dawson, the humbled flight attendant, gathered her courage and approached the cockpit during the final preparations for landing. "Captain Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly but resolute, "I know my earlier apology wasn't enough. I just wanted to say again that this experience has changed me. I'm committed to confronting my biases, learning from this, and becoming a better person. I hope that one day I can earn your forgiveness." Carter regarded her with a kind but firm gaze. "Claire," he said, his voice calm, "forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you give to others and to yourself. What matters now is what you do with this experience. Let it guide you to be the person I believe you can become." As the wheels touched down on the runway, the cabin seemed charged with an unspoken understanding. This flight had become more than just a journey from Florida to California. It had transformed into a powerful lesson in humanity, self-reflection, and the importance of equality. When the seatbelt sign ninged off, no one immediately moved. The usual rush to disembark was replaced by a sense of reverence for what had occurred. As Captain David Carter's voice came over the intercom one final time, thanking everyone for flying and wishing them well, the cabin erupted into spontaneous applause. This wasn't just applause for a smooth landing or excellent service. It was an acknowledgement of a shared awakening, a collective promise to do better, and a tribute to the quiet strength of a man who had risen above prejudice with dignity. As the passengers disembarked, many lingered near the cockpit door, hoping for a moment to thank Carter personally. When he finally emerged, he was met with a sea of faces diverse in age, race, and background, yet united in their newfound resolve. In the terminal, the buzz around Flight 2438 had already drawn a crowd. Travelers, airport staff, and even media personnel gathered to hear the story of the extraordinary journey. As Carter stepped into the concourse, applause broke out once again, echoing through the terminal. Among the crowd, Claire stood quietly, her eyes brimming with emotion. When the applause subsided, she approached Carter with a renewed sense of determination. "Captain Carter," she began, her voice steady this time, "I've already spoken with my superior. I've volunteered for our airline's diversity and inclusion program and signed up for implicit bias training. I've also offered to share my experience to help others learn from it. It's just the beginning, but I'm committed to doing better." Carter nodded, a faint smile on his face. "That's how change begins." A passenger stepped forward, an elderly man with a walking stick. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice quavering, "in all my years of flying, I've never experienced anything like this. You've taught me lessons I should have learned long ago. Thank you." In the crowd, the group of college students that were at the economy cabin of the flight listened intently as a young black lady from among the college students stepped forward. Her voice filled with admiration. "Captain Carter," she said, "you've shown us that breaking barriers is possible. Thank you for leading the way." And back to the podium at the seminar, while rounding up her speech, Claire Dawson said, "That was how Captain David Carter turned my perception around. And I stand here to say to all of you in this gathering, to shun all form prejudice against people, no matter their skin color or background. I am Claire Dawson." A big round of applause roared from the crowd of both the airline staff members and guests at the seminar. Captain David Carter with Captain Hale and Ethan were seen at the front row, clapping and beaming with bright smile. What did you learn from this amazing story? Let's meet at the comment section to discuss. If you have experienced issues like this before, do not hesitate to share at the comment section and how you were able to handle the situation. Also do well to subscribe to this channel and like this video. See you in another exciting story.